Hi, this is Abhilash Majumdar, a research scientist from Morgan Stanley. Previously, I used to work from HSBC as a deep learning and a NLP engineer. I have also been a contributor to several projects when it comes to Bert and Albert, and have contributed to them. I have mentored and professionals and students alike for organizations, for Udacity, Upgrad, Udemy, in terms of deep learning, NLP, AI, and I have experience in mentoring professionals and students in different aspects of deep learning. So, if you want to connect with me, you can definitely find the link in the description. Also, welcome to Co-Learning Lounge YouTube channel. So here we will be posting regularly updates on different NLP concepts like BERT, transformers, and also there are a lot of content which has already been published. So please go through that, and if you have any feedback, you can definitely uh, subscribe and always comment in the videos. And today we are going to cover the concept of attention in NLP. So attention is a very crucial concept in NLP when it comes to most of the transformer architectures that we see currently used nowadays, starting from BERT, GPT variants, and also graph transformers and all robust architectures. Attention is one of the most important parts which has led the revolution of NLP in general. So before we start discussing about attention, the most important thing about attention is the concept comes from computer vision models. So in computer vision, when we are trying to analyze a particular image, in this case, we have a picture of a dog who is apparently wearing a coat in winter. So if you want to understand what is the color of this inner sweater, which is white, and what is the color of the coat that is on the dog, it is it is a cluster of different colors. So attention means that we are applying certain information, we are applying certain emphasis on certain parts of the information to extract important features from it, right? And this concept of applying attention, getting more weights, emphasizing on certain features more on than the others, is the concept which drives current NLP. So before we move on to the attention part, so previously in the previous videos we talked about encoder decoder models, and we saw how encoder decoder models are collections of bidirectional or normal LSTM stacks or GRU stacks, and the decoder is again a version of having the same encoder architecture, or it may be different. And we saw how the between the intermediate layers, the channel or the flow of hidden cell states comes into the picture. We have also seen the flow of information from the encoder to the decoder, and also the input weights. Basically, in the context of neural machine translation, we have seen the importance of encoder decoder models, where we have varying sized inputs and varied sized outputs. But there are some disadvantages of normal encoder decoder models, because the sequence to sequence encoder decoder models, which we have been studying, has some drawbacks in terms of retaining more information. So since the encoder can be made up of bidirectional LSTM cells or stacks of cells, or normal GRU cells, only the last or the end or the terminal LSTM cell output or hidden state is passed to the decoder as the input. And this is not always helpful to retain all the information. Let's say we have a very large corpus, and just sending the terminal LSTM hidden cell output of the encoder to as the input to the decoder may not always help to capture all of the information. What we need is a sophisticated way to acquire certain weights or certain important words or phrases from the text which bear some important meaning. A decoder is again initialized with a context vector to emit the transformed output. So in the normal sense, the decoder does not have any particular way to understand or replicate those internal hidden weights. It does some normal calculation, we apply some feed forward network on it, but if we were to capture more information, that is not there. So, and there is also another drawback of having fixed sized inputs and fixed sized outputs. Now, fixed sized inputs and fixed sized outputs may not always be the case, but where we have in neural machine translation, we have seen that varying size outputs and inputs may come into the picture. So the sequence to sequence model already has these kinds of things. They have composition of an encoder that processes the input sequence and compresses the information into a context vector. right? And this context vector is mainly determined by the terminal LSTM hidden cell. That is the hidden cell state. And most of the cases that is expected to be a good summary, but entirely it is not true, because we are not getting the exact information, or if the corpus is really large. So, and the second important point is a decoder which is initialized with the context vector, that is the hidden cell output of the encoder of the transformed input. So that may not always again reciprocate the entire meaning or the entire translation of a word or a sentence in a different language. So essentially, we are missing out on some important meaningful words, or meaningful capture, or failing to capture certain important or emphasizing phrases, or clauses inside a particular corpus or a text script. So in this case, we come to the new idea of applying something called as attention mechanism for the neural machine translation task. Now, neural machine translation is a very sophisticated field where we have to remember or memorize long source sequences, because in NMT we need to, in order to infer a certain context from a particular language, we want to have as big length or as large corpus as possible, so that we can segregate the different aspects of that particular corpus into individual important phrases or important collection of words which convey meaning. So in that way, the input data for a particular NMT task is really large, and normal encoder decoders fail to work in that. So in this case, we have a particular mathematical formulation or a particular mathematical tool called as attention mechanism. So attention mechanism is nothing but applying certain computations like dot product multiplication, or applying some activation functions on top of the weights, so as to emphasize or accentuate on some parts of the text which bears some context or bears some important information. So while the context vector has access to the entire input sequence, we do not need to worry about forgetting. So this is another important feature. Forgetting is one of the most important features of encoder decoders, just like I mentioned. If we were to apply certain mathematical tools which were to capture the weights of the forgotten words or the forgotten phrases, that then it would be really helpful for our encoder decoder models. So that is where the beautiful part of attention comes into the picture. And this idea was done by Bhardanu in 2015, who covered the idea of in his paper of jointly aligning and translating. So here we can see that this is a stack of LSTM cells or any recurrent RNN variants, right? It can be GRUs as well. These X1, X2 are the source, that is the source of input. And these alpha 1, alpha 2 are particularly the weights attributed to all those hidden cells or hidden stacks of cells. So there are many mathematical computations or many different variants of computations of attention, but the basic form of attention is applying an additive form. That means what we're doing is we are particularly adding the hidden weights that we see over here, alpha 1, alpha T3, alpha T2, and all these kinds of things. And then we are applying some nonlinear activation on it. So in most of the cases, it is tanh activation. So we get the context vector from the individual attention weights. So these particular alpha T1, alpha T2, alpha T3, and alpha T4, these are particularly called as attention weights. We sum those attention weights together, which is known as additive style or Bhardanu style attention. And we try to apply a nonlinear activation, which is called tanh. And then we get the context vector from it. Now, why this is important? Because in this way, we are able to capture certain important weights from the input sequence in a much easier fashion. Just by adding some simple weights and applying a nonlinear activation essentially changes the output of what the decoder of what the encoder is going to give. So in the decoder case, which is given as the top over here, the stream of RNN cells, the input gets passed into the decoder as well as the context vector, and this is the most important thing. So instead of passing the individual hidden cell state of the last LSTM of the encoder cell, what we're passing the context vector. And this context vector essentially gives you a very good idea of the certain phrases that we want to be highlighted. And this is done by adding some important weights of the attention layer and applying some nonlinear activation on it, called as a Bhardanu attention. So this attention layer that we see is a parameterized by a simple feed-forward neural network, which in our case is just adding the weights and applying a nonlinear activation. And this is known as the additive attention or additive style of attention. And then we pass this context vector to the decoder along with the input vectors also, because we want the input vectors. if we were not interested in the NMT task, that is neural machine translation task, and if we were to concern ourselves with text classification, then and alongside it, a kind of an embedding layer would also have to be passed, as I mentioned in the previous video. But in this case, we are passing the context vector mainly, and we are getting the outputs from it. That is the output softmax probability distribution from the decoder. Now, by definition, mathematically, if we are to consider ourselves the input source sequence of length n and the target source sequence of length m, because in NMT it was mentioned that n and m, that is the lengths of the source and the output languages, may not be the same. The encoder is generally referred to as a bidirectional RNN or a bidirectional LSTM variant. And this is denoted by the hidden cells is denoted by H1 by the forward cell, and the backward arrow denotes the backward or the reverse LSTM direction. Right. So the decoder network has another activation state which we studied previously as well. It is almost similar to an encoder cell, aside from the fact that it has F into WHH into HT minus 1, which I showed in the previous video. So the same concept remains, just the attention part comes into the picture, which is given by this context vector CT. Now this context vector is a sum of the hidden states of the input sequence weighted by alignment scores. Now these weighted by alignment scores represent the attention weights. Now this CT is given by summation of AT HT, where AT, this is not AT actually, this is alpha T. Alpha T denotes the weights and HT denotes the hidden states of all the individual LSTM or RNN variants inside a particular encoder. So alpha denotes the weights multiplied by that corresponding LSTM cell hidden output of the encoder. And then we want to align. Align means we are effectively trying to apply a softmax activation on it. So this formulation that we see is a softmax activation. So exponential, that is the exponential part where E, that is essentially in mathematics, that is E powered, that is the score. Now the score is essentially we generate by applying some kind of tanh activation to the by adding the inputs. So whatever we see over here, that is alpha times the H1, that is the hidden LSTM encoder cells out for each time step, we just sum them and we apply a nonlinear activation called as the tanh. And with that tanh, once we get that additive style, we then apply the softmax distribution on top of it, just to get the scaled version of the context vector. Now this softmax actually scales the output so that we can have a proper context vector which can be passed as input to the decoder. And this is the basic idea of having a particular attention mechanism given by the additive style. So generally, the alignment models assigns a score alpha to the pair of input at position I and the output at position T, which I mentioned. Now this alpha is parameterized by a feed-forward neural network, which is some other context, because inside, if you want to apply certain weights, generally these are done with the help of dense layers or simple FFN, or that is feed-forward neural networks, right? In a single hidden cell, and the network is jointly trained and translated. Okay, by jointly trained means these are the weights are added, right? And then we apply a tanh activation that is given over here. The score is calculated with the help of the tanh activation that we see over here. Right. And after the score gets computed, we pass it through a softmax activation so as to scale the outputs of the context vector and get the context vector so that that particular context vector can be passed as input to the decoder model. And this is the first class of attention mechanism that we saw. That is the Bahadanu attention. That is one of the most classic features of attention. And the other thing is that this particular graph, heat map particularly, shows a translation of I think French to an English corpus. And you can see that by using the heat map as well, so beautifully the attention mechanism has translated some words or some phrases to their corresponding English counterpart, and vice versa to their French counterpart. So, and there are lots of families of attention mechanisms. As I mentioned, attention is nothing but a mathematical tool which tries to emphasize or pick up certain phrases or certain parts of a particular corpus. That corpus can be a textual corpus if you are considering in the field of NLP. That corpus can be an image corpus if you are considering in the field of computer vision. So in the case of NLP, we are trying to extract and abstract certain weights from the particular corpus, right? And try to examine that, accentuate that, and try to build a context vector from it. Now, due to this, there are many variants of the standard attention mechanism. And one of the most famous attention mechanism is the Luong attention mechanism, which is another important aspects of having also being known as the multiplicative style. So in Bahadanu, we saw the additive style. In Luang, we see the multiplicative style of attention. And so these are some of the variants where we apply different mathematical formulations to the input hidden cells, input hidden, of the input hidden states of the encoders, encoder LSTM or encoder GRUs. That is, one is called the context-based attention, where we apply a cosine transformation. We have an additive formulation that we saw now called as the Bahadanu, which is one of the most famous. We also have a location-based or a multiplicative style known as the Luong attention. The Luong attention is nothing but, instead of having an additive style, we are effectively multiplying the individual weights. We are effectively multiplying the individual attention weight vectors, and then we are taking a softmax distribution out from it. This simplifies the softmax alignment to only depend on the target position. So this can be considered as a blend between both global and local attention, which we will cover in a few moments. So general, there is also another standard form of attention mechanism, which is another way of a multiplicative style, another variant of a multiplicative style, which is just the dot product without applying any nonlinear activation as the in the output. Okay. Then we have the dot product attention, which is another variant of Luong attention. So Luong basically has three different kinds of attention mechanisms, but all of them are centered around dot product attention or multiplicative style attention mechanisms. And then we have the scale dot product attention, which is nothing but applying a scaling factor to the Luong attention, which is, and this particular paper by Vaswani 2017, which is known as Attention is All You Need, is one of the most famous papers in NLP. And this we will be covering up in the next part when we see about self-attention and how that can be computed in general transformer architectures. So if we were to refer ourselves with just the Luong attention as of now, so we can see that Luong attention generally derives from the fact that we are, instead of adding the weights, we are multiplying the weights of the attention vectors to derive the context vector. And in some cases, we apply some regularization to it. That is, we normalize the weights by using, which is called as a scale dot product, or we just generally do something called as apply a nonlinear activation. Sometimes it is called as a softmax activation on it. Now, there are, as I mentioned, we will be going into the self-attention. So just as an intro, self-attention or intra-attention is an attention mechanism which relates different positions of a single sentence in order to compute a representation of the same sequence. So what that effectively means that for you take a sequence or a sentence and you try to compute the self-attention, or apply the self-attention weights on parts of that same particular sentence instead of the entire corpus. So in that way, you can highlight certain parts of that same sentence and extract more context which are arising from certain intermediate phrases which are residing in that particular sentence. So this is known as a self-attention mechanism and is one of the most important aspects of abstractive summarization, question answering, and any other NLP tasks, which arise from sequence to sequence modeling. And then we know about soft and hard attention. Soft and hard attention is a very important architecture as well, because in soft attention we are essentially trying to gain certain features without by blurring some other features. This is actually a concept taken from computer vision, and one of the most important features of computer vision aspect is that let's say you have an image like this, and if you want to blur out certain important features from it and you want to show other important features inside of it, then that is where it comes into the picture. So the soft attention generally gives you, you have an LSTM decoder that consumes the convolution features to produce the descriptive words, or in this case, the descriptive pixels in computer vision one by one, where the weights are learned through attention. Actually, what happens that some parts of the pictures you want to not apply those attention mechanisms that you do not want to highlight, let's say the background, and some parts, let's say the characters which are present in an image, you want to highlight them. That means you are paying certain more attention to those particular pixels. Same way in the context of languages as well, this comes into the picture. Soft attention is generally referred to as the Bahadanu attention, right? Because in Bahadanu attention, as we recall, it is just an additive formula for adding the attention weight vectors. So you can think of them as just adding all of the weight vectors just and applying a softmax activation is like applying a soft filter on it. So all of the pixels in an image, or the words in a particular corpus will be scaled eventually. The model is very differentiable because we are applying a nonlinear activation on it. And second thing is that the expensive, because if the input corpus is very large, Bahadanu attention is like adding all the input weights and applying a nonlinear activation. That is effectively very time consuming. It is a compute intensive process as well. Hard attention is known as the Luong attention. Hard attention means that we are effectively abstracting certain important features by blurring out some other important features. And this is the pro feature of this is it is less calculation of attention at the inference time, because essentially we are not generally adding the features. We are just doing a dot product attention, or we are doing a scale dot product attention, or we are just multiplying the attention weights together. And the model may not be differentiable, because in this case, many cases we see that the long attention does not have the softmax activation in some parts. So there is no nonlinear activation effectively in the long part, just a dot product tensor that we get. So in that way, it becomes a non-differentiable model, and it requires more complicated techniques such as variance reduction or reinforcement learning to train. And the next different parts of attention is known as the global and the local attention, which is another very important part. Global attention and local attention is again, which is derived from the Luong attention. It is a very, the global attention is very much similar to soft attention, and the local attention is very much similar to the hard and the soft attention. It is actually a very beautiful blend between the hard and the soft attention, because if you can see in the image that we see, we are computing the weights, that is the global weights, by taking all the LSTM cells, H1, from all the hidden LSTM cells that we see. Okay, and we are not effectively abstracting a single weight uniquely. That means we are collecting all of them together. We are not abstracting a single weight uniquely. And then we are creating the context vector as usual. We are doing the dot product to have our context vector. But in the case of local attention, what we do, we selectively collect the context vectors, let's say of 3 words at a time or 3 LSTM cells at a time, and then we compute a context vector, and then again we shift to the next 3 cells or next 3 LSTM cells, and take their, multiply the scaled the dot product of the weights, and then we compute the context vector again. So this repeated operation of these kinds of things in the local attention model actually gives you a very good idea, or a very good abstraction of the important features or context in a particular sentence. So if we were to move into the second part, which is covered in Jay Alamart's blog post, so we will be now, we have seen about global attention, we have seen about local attention, we have seen soft and hard attention, we have seen the different mathematical formulations where different mathematical models work on attention, how different mathematical aspects change it. But here we will be looking into soft attention, one of the most important features of attention, and which essentially converts an encoder decoder model to a transformer model. So this is also an introduction to transformer architecture. And because since we will be looking into transformer architecture in depth in the future videos like BERT and GPT, all the concepts that are being told here remains the same. The essential concepts remain the same. So the transformer architecture essentially is a collection of encoder decoder models with attentions. And there are certain mathematical sophistications to this architecture, but essentially this is the core skeleton of a particular transformer architecture. So in this case, we have generally seen an encoder decoder to be a case of a neural machine translation. And we have seen variants where we can stack encoders on top of each other, and just the last or the terminal LSTM cell output is given as the input to the decoder model. Now, this is the case of a normal standard encoder decoder model. Now, if we were to apply or change the encoder part of a particular internal layers of an encoder in a certain way, so that it can also accommodate the attention mechanism, then it will be really helpful to have collections of encoders and collection of very robust attention-based decoders. So so that for training our model for any natural language tasks. Right. So this is where the idea of applying, having the transformer architecture comes into the picture. So the encoder architecture is slightly changed from having a stack of LSTM cells to having self-attention mechanism. Now this self-attention block essentially comprises of LSTM cells and a self-attention computation mechanism that we saw previously. So this self-attention mechanism, as we mentioned in the previous few seconds back, that this self-attention essentially means that we are applying some mathematical tools which can abstract, certain parts of phrases of a particular sentence from itself, right? And it is a very important tool. So with the LSTM cells or stack of bidirectional LSTM or GRU cells in the encoder part, we are also adding the self-attention part or any attention mechanism part, and then we are passing through a feed-forward neural network or a general dense network, right? And this gives us a stack of LSTM, a stack of encoder module. The encoders, and this is a robust description of that pictorial image of that particular encoder decoder architecture on how these are very usefully used in most of the cases. So you have the self attention, you have the feed forward network in a particular encoder cell, right? And then the output of the terminal encoder cell is passed as the input to the decoder. The decoder contains another self-attention module. It contains, inside of it, it contains an encoder decoder attention, which is another different block of cells, and it contains another feed-forward neural network or a simple dense network for the output. Now, if we were to consider ourselves with the important features of encoder decoders or self attentions, one of the most important aspects is that co-reference resolution. So let's say if we take this example, the animal didn't cross the street because it was too tired. Now, how it can refer to the animal is very difficult question for an encoder to answer. So in this case, the self attention allows it to associate with the animal. So as the model processes each word, self attention allows it to look at some part of the, as I mentioned, some phrases of that particular sentence in different orders. So it may, so for finding the self attention of it, it may look to the, this three words, that is the animal didn't. Then also it may look to animal didn't cross. So it effectively moves like a sliding window, analyzing, let's say, 3 to 4 words in a particular window to generate its answer, like which particular word it refers to. And this is the idea where this self attention becomes very helpful, is that self attention is the method of which transformers use to bake the understanding of a particular relevant words into the one that we are currently processing. If we see this picture over here, it is currently processing a certain words, these words in a particular window. So this is the particularly the window size, and these colors that we see is the weights of that particular window, weights of those particular words in that window. So the darker the colors, the more the weights. That means the more the emphasis of that particular word or correlation of that particular word with respect to the second word, right? So we can see that it has a high correlation with the animal and these kinds of words. And this is where the concept of self attention rises. This tensor to tensor notebook by Google Research is very, very important, and you can go through it to examine how this attention mechanism works in a sliding window manner. Now, if we were to expand this concept in mathematically as to how this self-attention detail works, essentially there is three important concepts. So there is a query vector, there is a key vector, and there is a value vector. So these three vectors, Q, K, and V, are very, very important. So the first step is in calculating self-attention is to create these three vectors from each of the encoder hidden cells. That is the input vectors or the hidden cells, or it can be the embedding vectors as well. In the context of translation, in the context of text classification, we also use an embedding vector, right? For each and every word. So in that way, we are using the query vector, we are using the key vector, and we are using a value vector. Now these vectors are very small. They need not to be large dimensions like 1024, 4096 like that. They are just 64 units, because that has been the optimal size that have been chosen by Google Research in their paper. Attention is all you need, right? And normal embedding matrices have dimensions of 512, 1024, 4096, and it goes on. So if we were to look like this, so the embedding vector is like this, which is denoted by x1 and x2. This is essentially the input vectors that we see. This can also be considered as input vectors for our use case. We have the query vectors, we have the key vectors, and we have the value vectors, and their corresponding weight matrices as well, WQ, WK, and WV. Okay. Now, what are these query, Q, and value vectors? So these are abstractions that are very useful for calculating about self-attention. So when you proceed, with reading how attention is calculated, then you will be able to understand and replicate as well how attention can be useful for any use cases in general language processing, right? The second step is calculating the self attention. Self attention is nothing but a concatenation of q dot k, that is if we were to in this case, if we're considering this word, that is thinking, right? It will have an embedding matrix, that is x1. It will have queries, and it will have keys, and it will have values, right? So the score is computed by having multiplying q1 with respect to k1, that is q into k, which gives you an output, right? And similarly, if you this is called as the self dot product of the q and the v, q and the k. Now similarly, if you want to do dot product in a cross manner, that means if you want to apply the multiplication between q1, right, and k2, so that will be kind of a cross multiplication, because in this way you are essentially not doing self, you are essentially doing cross attention mechanism, right? So the third and the fourth steps, so we essentially covered the first two steps, that means denoting our embedding matrix, and second, deciding our q query, keys and the values, right? Q, K, and V.
These matrices we have already determined. The third and the fourth steps are to divide or normalize these. So we generally divide by a score of 8. So this is given because root over 64 is 8, and the Google research people have essentially found that that is a good metric for our use case. So in this way, we have more stable gradients. So essentially what we are doing, once we have q1.k1, we are essentially dividing that by root over 64, that is 8. So essentially if we divide 112 by 8, we get 14. So in this way, essentially we are getting qk by root over dk. Now, dk is essentially nothing but the dimension of our embeddings. That means 64, which in our case. So we have taken a dimension of 64 in our case for our q, k, and v values, right? So in this way, we are taking root over dk as root over 64. So dk is essentially nothing but the dimensionality. That is our 64, right? And then we apply a softmax on it. So essentially what we are doing, we are multiplying q into k, we are multiplying 2 into q into k tensors, and then we are dividing it or normalizing it by 8. And then we are taking a softmax output, because the softmax score determines how each word will be expressed. And for any language modeling task, that is one of the essential features which comes as the output. So this covers our third and the fourth step. The fifth step is to multiply each vector by the softmax score. Right now, what we have done, we have already computed the softmax score. The fifth step is already is to multiply each vector value by the softmax score. Now this vector value, that means that once we are taking the softmax activated output, that is softmax of qk by root over dk, right? We then multiply it with v1, that is our values, right? So and then it becomes a different, then we sum them essentially. After applying the multiplication to it, we add them. The sixth step is to sum the weighted value vectors. So essentially sum, that z here is the sum of vi. Okay, so this is how the attention weights are calculated in the case of self-attention mechanism. Now, if we were to think about the matrix computation, how this is done in a matrix way. So the first way, we have already considered ourselves, and we have saw that q into k by root over dk, that is being done. Then after that, the softmax activation is done, and whatever we get, we multiply that with the values, that is the v, that is the v tensor or a v vector, and then we sum them to get the z. So this is our workflow. But how do we get q and k? So q and k is received or is attained by multiplying the embedded matrix, that is the x in our, that is our input sequence that we saw previously, that is the first step, input sequence x, with the the weight matrix or particular weight matrix for the q, k, and v. So if we recollect, we already have them initialized, right? We already have initialized wq, wk, and wv. So multiplying x1 with respect to wq, multiplying x1 with respect to wk, and we can get the corresponding q, k, and v values, right? So this is how this gets computed. So which is clearly represented by this figure here. So we multiply x with respect to wq to get q, again x with wk to get k, and x with wv to get the value matrix or the value tensor. And then what we do, we just apply q into kt, that is effectively to maintain the dimensionality, so that the matrix multiplication or tensor computation or tensor product actually takes place. We actually take the transpose of the k, that is the keys. Okay, and we multiply the queries and the keys tensor, and we divide it by root over 64, that is root over dk, and we take the softmax of that value and we multiply it with v, that is our values, and then we sum them over to get the value z. And this is our entire idea in a mathematical as well as a pictorial format, nicely represented by J.L. Amar in his blog about self-attention. Now, this self-attention is very important tool, but they are powerless. They are not having so much power when we use them individually. But what we do, we combine different self-attention heads together. And this is where the most important concept of transformers comes into the picture, which is known as multi-head self-attention. Multi-head self-attention is nothing but it expands the model ability to focus on different positions simultaneously, right? Instead, if you are having just self-attention on a single word, right, it will just compute on a single word. But what if you want to expand the model's capability to cover lots of phrases and lots of sentences? So in that way, z1 covers a little bit of every other encoding, but it could be denominated by the actual word itself. So in that way, we can we would want to know which word it refers to. So in this case, the multi-head attention mechanism, self-attention mechanism, effectively applies the attention weights or self-attention mechanism on a larger scale. So also it gives the attention layer multiple representation subspaces. That means whenever we are increasing the number of heads, essentially we are increasing the dimension of the attention mechanisms as well, attention subspace as well. So we are creating a manifold. So as we will see next, the multi-head attention we have is not only one, but a multiple sets of q, k, and v values. So instead of just one q, k, and v value, we have multiple such sets. And the transformer, that is the classic transformer, uses 8 attention heads, right? And so we end up with 8 sets of encoder decoders. So you can imagine how the transformer architecture gradually scales up from a standard encoder decoder with normal attention. So instead of having just a single attention, it applies so many heads or multi-head attention for self-attention, right? And it applies q key and query key and value weight matrices 8 times, right? So you have 8 attention heads. This is given by the figure over here. So this is particularly for attention head 0 and attention head 1. Imagine comprising all of them 8 times. So you will be having WQ, WK, and WV 8 repeated over 8 times, right? And when we move over to the actual attention matrix, so it becomes really, really big. So this is effectively the computation that is being done. If we were to consider ourselves into 8 heads or eight layered classical transformer architecture, this is where the architecture comes into the picture. So you have WQ, WK, and WV. This is 1, this is 2, this is 3, up till 0 to 7. That is 8 times it will be there. So you compute the Q, K, and V from 0 to 7, that is 8 times, and then you apply the regularization, that is root over 64, then you do softmax, and then you add them to get Z0 to Z7. And this is very, very important, and this is given by the picture over here. So when you see this, it gives you a very good idea how this multi-head attention is playing. So this red colored or the orange colored arrows or orange colored lines are very important as they show one attention head, whereas the green colored arrows show the second attention head. So imagine if we were to analyze this particular example by using 8 attention heads. So there would be lots of simultaneous computation which is being done, and this is how it looks like. So in this case, you can see there are so many colors, right? So effectively, these are from 0 to 7. So I think 0 to 7. So all these colors represent the different attention heads which are getting computed simultaneously. Now we have mostly covered the attention mechanism, because attention generally, because the most important feature of attention is self-attention, and multi-head self-attention that we have covered already. And we have also seen the different aspects or mathematical formulations of other different attentions, like the classical Bahadani attention, the Luong style multiplicative attention, hard attention, and soft attention. And so we have covered most of the attention details. So if we move ahead forward, so we have already gone into in depth about the classical transformer model, which uses 8 multi-head attention in a transformer in a standard encoder decoder model, or a bidirectional encoder decoder model, to give you a proper classical transformer architecture. We can just go ahead and go into in depth of how the transformer architecture actually looks like. So you have the encoder decoder models that we see. We also have a particular thing called as the position embeddings, right? So the position embeddings essentially give you the positional attributes or positional features. Actually, they are tensors collected by applying the position vector for a particular word or a particular word vector. So when we were to do about the standard transformer architecture, one of the most important, let me just show you the big picture of the transformer architecture. So essentially, the transformer architecture gives you a proper idea about the entire workflow of how these kinds of encoder decoder models, along with self-attention, multi-head self-attention, and these kinds of things takes place. So essentially, this is what a particular encoder part of a I would say a stack of encoder part of a transformer architecture looks like. So we have seen that initially we had mentioned that inside an encoder, we have modified the stack of LSTMs only to also contain a self-attention module. Then we have certain layer called as an add and normalize. Add and normalize is nothing but a mathematical formulation, mathematical layer which tries to add and tries to apply, normalize the weights of the attention mechanism, right? So it is essentially kind of, you can analyze this similar to Bahadanu attention, where we are analyzing and adding the weights of the attention, self attention, right? And we are normalizing them. So you can think of them as a normalized version of Bahadanu attention, right? And then we are having, a feed forward neural network stack, right, where it comprises of dense networks. And then again we are normalizing that particular output, right? So we are normalizing the output of that particular feed forward neural network, right? And we are adding the weights of that feed forward neural network output, and we are normalizing them. So this is our encoder stack one, and effectively these encoder stacks get repeated over and over again. So in this way, we, instead of having a self attention layer, we are effectively concatenating different self attention mechanisms to have a multi-head self attention mechanism for the encoder side. And similarly, for the decoder side, it is very much simple, which is given by this particular GIF over here. So encoder and encoder, it produces an output. So this key and the value of the encoder is passed into the decoder module. So the decoder module, as I mentioned, decoder has comprises of that, the self attention mechanism. It also has an encoder decoder attention, right? And it also has a feed forward neural network inside the decoder. So decoders are stacked on top of each other, and the final ultimate output of the decoder is passed through a linear and a softmax, a softmax activated linear or a feed-forward dense network, right? So in this way, this GIF explains very beautifully. If we were to stack all the encoders in a single manner, right, and call them as the encoder stack. So the output of this encoder stack will be the, the K and the V, right? And we are concerned ourselves with these two values because the attention values, the input values of the encoders gets transferred or, transformed into K and V by the self attention mechanism, multi-head self attention mechanism, and then you are passing them as inputs to the decoder. So and it also takes into consideration the previous inputs, right? And it gives you the output by passing it through a softmax activated simple dense model, right? And this is effectively what a traditional or a simple transformer looks like. It has, these kinds of self attention layers. It applies certain normalization to at each of the step so as to normalize the weights for smoother gradient convergence. And it also tries to apply the different weights. It tries to apply different feed forward neural networks to gain accuracy and gain performance. And effectively, this is what a classical architecture of a transformer looks like. So how a classical encoder decoder model, which only transmits just the hidden cell output of the last LSTM terminal LSTM cell, gets transferred into such a robust architecture where it transmits, where it collects that particular H, or for all the intermediate LSTM cells of the encoder, and tries to apply certain mathematical formulations, complex mathematical formulations like attention mechanism, or either Bahadanu or Luong attention, or more appropriately self attention, multi-head self attention, to create these key value pairs or key value vectors, right? Query key and value vectors, and applies some softmax activation on it and tries to give some outputs. So this is effectively what makes the transformer architecture more robust than a standard encoder decoder network. And this is where you are applying lots of information, you are passing lots of corpuses to it, and since the LSTM is boosted by the self attention mechanism, lots of information gets stored for longer sequences. And that is why the architectures that we see prevalently are comprising of BERT, either BERT or Albert, or distal BERT, or any other model. They are applying these kinds of technologies or these kinds of layers inside of it, right? So effectively, the last layer is effectively the linear and the softmax layer, which is very much the same as in the case of a normal encoder decoder architecture. But and this entire thing comprises the entirety of what attention is. So it is not just a mathematical tool. There are many variants of attention which tries to encapsulate and capture lots of attention weights, certain important phrases of a particular sentence or a corpus, and tries to apply certain weights on them, tries to emphasize or derive context vector from it. So lots of important features we have discussed, from self attention, global attention, hard attention, soft attention, multi-head attention, and also discuss the classical transformer architecture comprising of 8 attention heads and 8 stacks of encoders and decoders, right? So in the next video, we will be covering more about the BERT architecture. We will also be drawing inference from this particular video from the classic transformer architecture and see how the BERT is more efficient transformer than and has been one of the most popular neural architectures up to date. So that was all for this video, and I hope to see you guys in the next video tutorial. Thank you.